So Feliciano Centurión was an artist who was born in Paraguay, moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina in the early 1980s. And his career was tragically short. This exhibition covers only about 6 years. He died in 1996 from HIV-related illness, and his work was kind of lost or not really exposed in the period from 96 until now. So this is really the first opportunity for audiences to see a very representative selection of his works.
Feliciano Centurión is a great example of contemporary artists that haven't been known internationally because they had a more local presence while they were alive, but whose works are very important to understand the cultural times in the Americas during the 1990s.
There was a phrase that was used a lot of the time, which is the personal is the political. And I think he really embodies that spirit in being able to talk about his sexuality, his body, his sickness, and particularly being diagnosed with HIV. You know, it was a very stigmatized illness. It was something people didn't want to talk about. There was a lot of hysteria in the press about this kind of gay plague. So the fact that his work explicitly talks about the sickness, talks about the effects on his body, talks about his mortality, talks about his feelings of love, his feelings of religion, you know, there's that very personal world, very exposed, I think that's a very new spirit in art in Latin America in the 1990s.
He discovered in 1980s blankets, right? And this is very important because he would paint on blankets, either little blankets that he would create or the big blankets that you would buy for a house. These are blankets that were being used for moving, for storage, but also blankets used by humble people to find shelter.
He's taking materials that would be considered sort of kitsch or bad taste. He would buy them in Plaza Once, which is kind of the garment district of Buenos Aires, so no real sort of fine artist would ever go there. But he loved those kind of extravagant kitsch, like grandmother-y type embroideries and fabrics, and he would incorporate those into his work.
The whole exhibition goes around this exploration with the idea of blankets, and it's titled Abrigo precisely because of that. Abrigo in Spanish means both shelter, protection, but also warmth. This multiplicity is what we were looking for, and that's why we kept the title in Spanish. And it also means refugee. So the blanket became a metaphor for him and for us of the type of shelter, protection, and community that he was looking as a migrant artist that had arrived from Paraguay and from rural areas from Northeast Argentina to the big metropolis of Buenos Aires in the 1990s, seeking for a shelter where he would feel more protected among his new community of friends, but also where he would feel better received as a queer artist, and you know, and where he would also find, like in the blankets, the warmth that he had lost moving from a subtropical area to a cold city like Buenos Aires.
Being from Paraguay, there's a very rich handcraft tradition, particularly lace work, ñanduti, they call it. It's very characteristic Paraguayan lace, and he incorporates that into his work too. So I think he's talking about his identity as a Paraguayan immigrant into Buenos Aires, kind of bringing these things that are invisible or that are kind of badly seen or considered bad taste, and incorporating them very happily and very confidently into his work.
A piece that I think is a great example of his work in general, and that is very telling, is the small piece that is on the exhibition. It's called Busco Refugio, I Seek Shelter. This small piece is also incorporating a coaster that he probably bought in a market in Paraguay, that it has a figure of a lady with the colors of the Paraguayan flag. By adding Busco Refugio, the idea of seeking for refugee and for shelter into this touristic memorabilia that has to do with his homeland, he's also discussing his own personal history. His family had to escape from Paraguay due to the persecution during the Stroessner dictatorship in the 1970s, and they had to first migrate so that his father could find work on the Argentinian side of the border. Then Centurión has to migrate to study and to develop himself as an artist to Buenos Aires, and he's also seeking for shelter as a recent migrant in a big city. So I think the idea of refugee and shelter is very important in his own personal biography, but it's also something that is very telling of the experience of an immigrant, and it's something that is very informative of the 1990s, but obviously of contemporary times also. I mean, we are living in a time when migration becomes more and more a phenomena that nations have to see, and where people look desperately for shelter. And his work through this beautiful and very apparently cheerful imagery is also talking about this humanitarian crisis and these personal crises that the artist and also the audience might go through.
So the first room focuses on these very large, kind of exuberant, extravagant animals painted on these very cheap blankets. The second room, which is where we are now, is the sort of the mature bulk of his work. So a lot of works that incorporate embroidery, materials that he would buy in the street markets. Many of them have phrases on them where he talks about love or talks about very sort of intimate things. And then the third room really covers a period from his diagnosis to his death, where he narrates and he talks about his feelings of his impending death. He talks about his illness. He starts to incorporate a lot of religious imagery, talking about the soul, kind of his reflections on the journey he's about to take. So one of the really important works in this exhibition is this large blanket with the sacrificed lamb. According to the story, is the work he painted when he was first diagnosed. So there's clearly a sense of, this kind of sacrifice, this image of death. At the same time, it's a very Christian symbol, the sacrificed lamb, lamb being the metaphor for Jesus, and the fact he's on this kind of altarpiece. And the lamb's face is remarkably calm, so it's this kind of acceptance of this sacrifice that's going to come. And he did have from his work, we have a sense of his acceptance of his death. They're not angry works, they're actually very poetic, they're very calm. He talks a lot about peace, he talks a lot about rest. The other very important work in the show are these 4 pillows, which are probably the last works that he made. So he did a lot of small embroidery, which, I imagine that was what he could do. But the message in those works, they're very warm and they're very heartbreaking at the same time. So he talks about rest, he talks about divine light of the soul, he talks about dreaming. There's one where he says, I'm alive, so he's really kind of holding on to those last months of his life.
Even when he is diagnosed with AIDS, and even as he is facing the disease, he decides to make works that are not dramatic, but works that are like a message, a testimony for the future and a testimony for himself and for his loved ones. And I think that's what makes his work so powerful and so exemplary and so amazing. That is a work that was being honest and informative, but at the same time, very political.
There's something so immediate about the work, so disarming, so sort of generous, as if somebody was wanting to talk to us. And so many of the phrases are in first person. You really feel that you're kind of entering this intimate world of a very special person. So I think there's something of that kind of basic humanity in here that I think comes through in his work. And then obviously when you confront his death, you really feel that you get to know him in this very vulnerable, very sensitive moment. And I think he managed to express that in such a special way. These objects really are a kind of gateway, between life and death, and between sort of knowing somebody and not knowing somebody. So I hope that that's what this exhibition can communicate.